Welcome back to another Ableton Live sound design tutorial. This, I think, might be the 8th or 9th video in this tutorial series. And we've sort of come to the end of the road, which has taken us to a very interesting device, which is Ableton's sampler device. Ableton has two sampling devices, sampler and simpler. And as I'm sure you can imagine, the simpler device is a more simple version of sampler. So sampler gives a lot more sound design capabilities. So we've sort of rounded out all of Ableton's main synthesizers. We covered operator first, then we moved to analog, then we moved to wavetable, and now we're on sampler. And the type of synthesis this time, because we looked at subtractive synthesis, FM synthesis, and wavetable synthesis, which are the main types of sound design synthesis, we're going to be looking at a slightly different type of synthesis that is done in sampling devices or any good sampling software synthesis instrument that you might have. And what we're doing is, I believe, what I'm going to call it or refer to it as is sample synthesis. So what you might be thinking is, well, how does sampler or just a sampler fit into this discussion? Because I thought you just chucked in a sample and then the sampler just plays it back and you can play it on the keyboard. Well, you can do so much more and you can get the most unique sounds that no one will have. And it's very similar to Wavetable in that what we're doing is we're taking a small piece of an existing waveform and we are essentially looping it over very small sections of time. It's just very unique. So we're going to jump right in here. So as always, we are going to right click up here and we're going to insert a MIDI track, which you can also do with the hotkeys Command-Shift-T. And we are going to record enable. As always, we've got our categories here, so I'm sure you're probably aware that we would want to go to the instruments category because that's where all of our synthesizers are at. These are all our MIDI instruments, and these are all the ones that come with Ableton. So you'll see sampler and simpler. We'll click on simpler first. We've got this control panel for simpler, and this is where we'll drop the sampler, and where we would drop our sample. And if we right click, we can convert simpler to sampler. And we've got all of this stuff here that we can play with. Don't let that confuse you. You don't have to use every single knob and button in every synthesizer. In fact, a lot of times you won't. And also, just to show you, you can always go sampler back down to simpler. So we're going to do sampler because it's the most robust. And if I'm going to be doing sound design tutorials in Ableton, I'm going to be doing them in sampler. Unless I want to use some of the unique features in simpler, then I might maybe do that. It's good for other things, but for more of a sound design type thing, we would rather be in sampler. So what are we doing right now in sampler? Well, going back to our sound design playbook or handbook, I don't know what I called it in the last one, we start with the waveform. So right now, there's no waveform, okay? There's no waveform. And our waveform can be anything. We're looking for a sampler, so we're looking for a sample. If you come down here to samples, you'll just see all the different samples that have come in. It really doesn't matter what we use. It really doesn't. Because what we're going to do is we're going to add such an incredibly small, looping a very small section. So let's do that. Let's do this one. Bell Folly. The reason why I'm picking this is because, and double click on sampler here, and we're going to drag and drop. So if we hit a button, we'll hear the sample. Let's zoom in here just to make sure. Okay, I just want to make sure we're starting it. I'm going to turn snapping off. So that says, where will it start? What we're going to be doing here is we're going to be looping over and over a very small portion of this, and it's going to turn it into a synthesizer. So right now, if we hit a note, you can play it like you would on any sampler, but that's not what we're going to do. We're going to come over here and we're going to click the sustain mode. And for right now, I'm going to just go click this sustain mode. What we want to do is we want to zoom in on a very, very small portion of this. So see now how I activated loop? And so I want to take a very small, very harmonically dense portion so I can get extra sound design synthesis possibilities. And I want to loop it. So I'm just going to come in here and we need to really bring this in. So let's come into audio effects and let's go into utilities and let's drop a tuner. And let's also drop a spectrum. And we're going to click the triangle to open it up. Here we go. So as we bring this in, notice how we're going to get a note. Okay, so now when we take a look at over here, it's playing in E flat. Now, I want to tune it because right now I'm playing a C note, but it's saying it's a B. So we want to come over here to our root note and we want to adjust this till we get our C note so we can play in scale. That's pretty important. Unless you don't care if you're what note you're in. So we'll go to the detune and we'll bring it up a little bit. And I'm going to come in here and I'm going to open this up. I'm going to drop in reverb on here just to give us a little space so it's not so crazy. And then what I'm also going to do is I'm going to go into the filter panel and I'm going to lower the filter because we've got our dense, bright waveform now. And now we're going to use the filter to sculpt it. See how nice that sounds? Like, we really didn't have to do much. So this is a low pass filter and we gave it some resonance to boost it. So if you take away the resonance, you might be thinking, let's add some movement to the resonance. That's a good idea, but we'll do that later. So we're going to come back to the sample tab here, and this was our initial waveform. And we're only looping this tiny little part, which actually this isn't that small of a part, but it gives us a really good sound. And this is our waveform. So in subtractive synthesis, it said start with a bright waveform, manipulate it with the filter envelope. This type of synthesis, sample synthesis, and to an extent wavetable synthesis, as we saw in the last video, it says you're going to be starting with the bright waveform again. But in Wavetable, it came from the different wavetables it provides, whereas with Sampler, we are actually basically generating our own wavetable. Now, the drawback is that in wavetable synthesis, you can scan through the wavetable and it stays in pitch. So it'll stay in C. But if we move this, you'll see it'll change. So right now, look, we've got this fundamental at F. Now watch what happens when I move this. Command Z to undo. So we can actually do that a little bit to give it like a pitch shift. And then we can also do the same thing with the actual pitch. So we got two different pitch shifts going on, modulations, on modulations, You know it. We're getting really deep into this. Actually, not that deep. Only deep if you haven't used this before. So what's next? So we started with our waveform. We then put it through a filter, which is right here. We've got our filter envelope right here. This is where we add our filter envelope amount. And then we've got our volume envelope, which is basically just it's all up. So when you hold down a note, the volume which it sustains, and by the way, this is the volume section. After the volume section, it then is what you hear. So when we're playing this G note, it says, since we have no attack, it says start at full volume, and when you hold down the note, sustain it at full. Whereas if I moved it down, how it tails off. I'm going to leave it open for now. I'm going to make sure we've got that release. And now we're going to come to our filter envelope. And I'm going to actually use pretty much the same filter envelope they have right here, but it doesn't enact until we give it an amount. And when we give it an amount, what it's going to do is it's going to start all the way up and then swoop. It's going to swoop back down. So see how it's right here? We've got no attack, and then it swoops down. So it says over 600 milliseconds, it's going to go from fully open to fully closed based on the amount. So let's play some notes. Nothing, because we have to add an amount. By the way, I'm playing these notes just on my laptop's keys. And I used to think it was weird to do that. I'm like, why not play on your MIDI keyboard? Well, it's because it's so convenient, because I'm like playing notes with my left hand and I'm tweaking the synthesizer. It's just great. And I can do a tutorial on how to play on how the layout is, but I'll move forward. So adjust the decay to what you like. Maybe even add some more sustain. So right there, we're pretty much done, but we can do other things. So let's go into the pitch oscillator tab, and let's give it a little bit of a pitch envelope. Little dab will do ya. If you saw my other video, you'll probably get that. So let's give it so this is going to say it's going to start at 2 semitones, and it's going to come down over 600 milliseconds. Sounds familiar. Anyways, let's move the decay in. Let's deactivate the pitch envelope. So this is a good way to just get an extra punch if some of your sounds don't have punch. It's very subtle, but if we move out the decay, and we can also move this down and have it do the opposite effect. What I normally find is very small amounts to give a punch is just going to give you the most musical amount. So let's start it up at an octave above. Just gives a little punch. Truthfully, it's not doing much because we already have, like, you get punch from going from a high frequency down to a low frequency, and you also get a punch sound from going from a higher pitch to a lower pitch over a short period of time. So we really don't need that, but I wanted to just kind of show you the pitch envelope. But what will be interesting is if we enact the oscillator. So we can actually give oscillator FM modulation to our sounds. So let's bring it in kind of short. Nothing. Why? Because we have to assign an amount, and the amount is over here in volume. Listen to how it changes when I start adding up the volume. You're going to notice we're going to get some FM modulation being added in. How are we getting that FM modulation? It's actually modulating it with a sine wave, and you can change the modulation sources. I'll stick to sine waves for now. Doesn't sound very musical, but if we move in the decay, now let's deactivate. Just dirties it up a little bit. Let's give it a little sustain. Just beefs, it gives it a little bit extra. So what else can we do? Well, we can go into our modulation tab, and I'm going to go to this LFO1, and I'm going to turn off retrigger. So I think I've already kind of explained the retrigger mode. It just lets the LFO run freely. So each time you hit a new note, it doesn't start it at the same point. And what I'm going to do is, I turned it off and turned it back on. For some reason, it had these other fields grayed out. I'm going to give a little bit of modulation. I'm going to turn the frequency down to the filter. So what it's going to do is it's going to move this filter frequency a little bit, just to give it a little bit more dynamicism over time, some dynamic movement over time. So listen to how it changes. That's too much. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this from our LFO from a sine wave to a random noise oscillator wave, because I want it to be more random. Let's move it up. See how these are sort of kind of moving around a little bit here? I'll do a pitch a little bit too. If you do too much, you can really hear its effect if you bring it up like that. I'm going to add a little bit to volume too. Hear how that pitch really jumped up high? You really want to play around with these, so that's why you want to kind of hit notes and play around. So I'm hitting the same note, but it sounds different because I'm introducing these subtle modulations. I'm going to take the filter down a little bit. That's a little too high. 24 is extreme. That's the most you can get. This is a little high for pitch. And then I'm also going to put some on pan, a lot on pan, so it'll bounce around. Yeah, you can hear that moving around a little bit. Also, something interesting you can do is you can come over here to Filter Global, and under Random Pan, you can turn that up, and each time you play it, instead of playing it right in the center, it'll play it on the sides. It'll choose a side. Can you hear that moving around a little bit? So these are just a few things to do. Obviously, we can come in here and add a filter drive. And you can add some EQ, take out some of the harsh frequencies. I normally do this later. Give it some compression. I like to get a little bit of gain reduction there. See how it's punchier and beefier? I like the reverb. Let's add a delay. I'm going to add the delay before the reverb. I'm going to take it off sync. Lower the dry wet a bit. Way too much. Just put down the dry wet. Put it on ping pong. See if I like ping pong better. I'm going to put it back on sync. Put it... And another thing too, you can always go into MIDI effects, drop a pitch, push it up an octave. It's pretty loud. So yeah, there's just a lot of, wow, this sounds good as a bass. So to close things off, guys, when you're designing sounds, it's not all that complicated if you go to the sound design playbook. You start with the waveform, you then manipulate its timbral quality, so its harmonic content over time, typically through the use of a filter, and then it goes to a volume envelope, and then that's what you hear. And then you'll have LFOs, which will add a certain amount of movement over time. And then you've got audio effects. And I'm going to make a tutorial where I basically simplify all the audio effects. In short, like there's certain audio effects you're just going to use on most sounds. You don't need to, but it'll just make a long list be very condensed. So I wanted to get through all of these different synthesizers that Ableton has. We did analog. Collision isn't used a whole lot. It actually is a physical modeling synthesis. In fact, that was the other synthesis, is physical modeling synthesis. Physical modeling synthesis is done in Collision and it's done in Tension, which are probably the least used devices. Collision basically is like a percussion physical modeling synthesizer, and Tension is like a string physical modeling synthesizer. Physical modeling synthesis basically attempts to recreate real world physics as to how the sound will be shaped. So it's not as it's a bit different, and you really have to kind of learn that synthesizer's architecture of how it does it. But yeah, then there's electric, which is an electric piano synthesizer, which is really fun. We can mess with that too. But the real biggies, if you're trying to design your sounds, is operator, analog, sampler, wavetable. And if there's other things you want to see, I can play around with collision and tension. I'm not as savvy with those because I don't use them as much, and sometimes it can be kind of hard to get good sounds. And but in any event, we can do that. So if you found this useful, please like, comment, and subscribe. In fact, that's already it.